Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the Constitutional Convention and all the decisions that came out of that huge convention that was going to be held in 1787. And here I have as my subtitle, The United States of America 2.0. And the reason why I'm calling it 2.0 is because the United States really did exist for a long period of time before the Constitution, the big document that governs how our government looks today. There was a period of time when that document did not exist. And we know it didn't exist because we had the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, the states were supposed to act in a firm league of friendship, but that didn't always work out. And as we saw in the articles that we had read previously, there's a lot of competition among the states, and there were issues with the states taxing items from other states and that they created their own money. So, for example, if I was here in New Jersey and I wanted to go to New York, I would need to get New York dollars because my New Jersey dollars didn't mean anything in New York State. So that would have created a huge issue for trading across state borders. Now, the Articles of Confederation intentionally left the central government or the national government weak on purpose. When the founders wrote the Articles of Confederation, they saw the problem with a strong central government. They saw the problem with Parliament and the King of England, and they said they didn't want America to look like England. They wanted it to be different. And they purposely gave a lot of power to each individual state. Now, the problem with that is that Congress didn't have a lot of power. It couldn't pass taxes. So Congress would call an army to fight for independence, but when Congress asked the states for money to support the army, the states could turn around and say, no, that's not going to happen. So states were not always acting in the interest of the country. They were always acting with their own interest in mind first. And it was very difficult to get laws to pass under the Articles of Confederation because it requires 9 out of 13 states. Now, 9 out of 13 states doesn't seem like a lot, but that's an overwhelming majority. It's not just a simple majority at half the states, which would have been 7 out of 13. You need more than half the states to approve a law under the Articles of Confederation. So that created a huge issue, especially if regions of the country didn't always agree with one another. So in May 1787, there's going to be a constitutional convention called, and they're going to meet in Philadelphia in Independence Hall. It's a very historic place. The Declaration of Independence was also written there. And they're going to start this convention on May 14, 1787. And when the delegates showed up to Philadelphia, they were really just thinking about fixing the Articles of Confederation. And they all came with the goal of revising, editing, and reinstating the Articles of Confederation. However, a couple of days into the convention, they decided that it was not going to be so easy to revise those articles. They ended up choosing George Washington to be president of the convention and to oversee everything that they were doing. And the delegates, as I said, realized that it was not going to be possible to just revise the articles, and they chose instead to throw out the articles and start over. The articles just left so many things undesirable for the new country. They saw how bad the government was, and they needed a stronger federal system, a stronger central government. So what they really thought going into this discussion, they thought that power should not be in just one government body. They thought that Congress was a good idea, but it wasn't perfect. But they also didn't want to create one person who had ultimate power either. They didn't want a king to come back in. After all, they had seen a king and a strong government with England, and we had just fought a war to get away from England. So why would we want to reinstate a government that looked exactly like England's? They also thought about creating 3 branches of government, which we're going to get into in just a few moments. And those branches would make sure that one other section of the government could not get too powerful. and we're going to talk a little bit more about how the government checks and limits itself. What they disagreed about was what should the legislature look like. And the legislature is a group that makes the laws or the rules for the country. They also disagreed about how to count a state's population and what numbers should truly be used to represent a state's population. So for the first disagreement that the delegates had over the size of the legislature or what the legislature was going to look like, there were two plans. And these are two very important names and two names that might be very familiar to you, because one person, James Madison from Virginia, is who our town is named after. And then we have William Patterson of New Jersey, who has a college named after him. So under the Virginia plan, James Madison proposed that the legislature should have two houses in Congress, that there should be two sections of Congress that would have to vote on laws together, and when they completely agree, that law becomes a law that can be passed. However, Madison said that the population of a state determines how many votes a state would get in both houses of Congress. Now, this plan was intentionally good for larger states. And when we say large states, we don't mean having tons of land, we mean having tons of people. So if you had many more residents in your state, the Virginia plan was going to favor you because you would have had more representation in Congress. Under William Patterson's New Jersey plan, he really favored the plan that was in the Articles of Confederation, where Congress was just going to have one house. There was just going to be one group of individuals who would meet. And he also advocated for keeping the same system under the Articles, where there would be equal representation, one vote for each state. So there were 13 states, there would be 13 votes in Congress. And he said that this would protect the smaller states. So why should Virginia, with its 750,000 people, have so many more votes than New Jersey, which had many fewer people? So the concern was which group was going to be more prevalent or powerful. And the two sides would not truly come to an agreement. Ultimately, they would have to come to some kind of compromise or an agreement or a settlement of a dispute that is reached by each side making concessions. They might have to give something up in order to achieve a common goal. And the compromise is going to come in the form of the Great Compromise. And this here is Roger Sherman, and he's going to write the Great Compromise, or what's also known in some history books as the Connecticut Compromise. And he's going to compromise and find a way that makes big and small states happy with government. So he's going to take bits and pieces from both plans and put them together. And what he says is he's going to keep a part of the Virginia plan where there's two houses in Congress. So two groups. And he's going to call those two groups the Senate and the House of Representatives. Under that Senate, there's going to be a different term limit, there's going to be different powers, and it's going to be the upper house. The House of Representatives would be the lower house, again with different powers and term limits. So the Senate was built to have equal votes per state. And instead of having one vote per state, he proposed having 2 votes per state. But it didn't matter if you had 100 people in your state or 100,000 people in your state. Every state would receive the same number of votes. So he preserved William Patterson's New Jersey plan in the upper house. He decided that the lower house would be called the House of Representatives, and that would be based on your population size. So if your state had 1,000 people, you might get 1 vote. If you had 10,000 people, you might get 10 votes. And that made it fair so that each group's population would receive representation in Congress. And no state would not have a vote in the House of Representatives. So if you didn't have a lot of people in your state and it seemingly felt that, or would appear that you shouldn't have representation, Roger Sherman said every state has to have at least 1 vote in the House of Representatives. Now we turn to the issue of slavery, and slavery was something that really was going to hold up the development of the Constitution. There were groups of states that truly felt that slavery was not something that we wanted to have in this new country founded on the principles of freedom. There were other groups of states on the complete opposite side of this argument, and they thought it was extremely important to the economy, particularly in the South, where there were large farms called plantations. And they felt that they needed to preserve this as a way to keep that economy going. So the big issues regarding slavery in our nation's founding document here with the government in the Constitution were over runaway slaves, should enslaved persons count in a state's population, and then should the United States allow enslaved workers to be brought into the country. And again, there's going to be very loud, screaming, arguing debates in Independence Hall over this very issue. And we even saw that in Liberty's Kids when they were debating back and forth, and they really were not happy with one another. And again, there's going to have to be compromise. And the reason for that is that the states in the South would not have agreed to enter into the United States. Remember, even though the Articles of Confederation were technically being thrown out, the Articles of Confederation were still the law of the United States. And 9 out of 13 states would have been required to approve the Articles of Confederation. Well, if there are 5 southern states and 5 states that would really want to see slavery continuing, well, if we have 13 states and we have 5 states that are holding on to slavery, there's 8 states that want to get rid of slavery. That's still not enough to get the new Constitution passed. So because there wasn't that overwhelming majority, the northern states had to make some concessions to the South. And that was in order to get this document passed. So what they decided was that slavery would be allowed to continue until 1807, and the United States actually does vote to ban the international slave trade, meaning bringing in new slaves from other parts of the world, in 1808. That was the earliest date that the Constitution allowed it to end, and the United States does vote to end it. The United States, however, as we know, does not vote to end slavery itself. The Constitution itself, though, also guarantees a fugitive slave law would be enforced in the United States. And what this means, a fugitive is someone who's running away. And what that guaranteed Southerners was that if one of the enslaved workers from the South escaped to the North, where there was the promise of freedom, that because all of the states were in the United States, they would have to send captured slaves back to the South. And these fugitive slave laws actually become even more strict and harsh as time goes on. However, we know that there's a group of individuals called abolitionists who are going to really fight to break this law, to disregard this law, and to help countless numbers of slaves escape to freedom in the northern states, or even further beyond the northern border into Canada, where they wouldn't be returned to slavery. One of the other compromises was, again, overpopulation. So when we talk about the compromises for women, we saw that the House of Representation, or the House of Representatives rather, is based on population size. Well, how do we derive your population? We saw in the activity we did on the convention that there were a number of enslaved persons in a state and a number of free persons in a state. So states in the North didn't need to count their enslaved persons in their populations because their populations were predominantly freed people, about 90% and above in most states. In the South, we saw that states had 20, 25, even as high as 40% of their populations were enslaved. So if those individuals were not counted in a state's population, then the populations of, for example, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina would be so much lower than what their true total population was going to be. So the North again had to compromise and allow the South to count its enslaved persons as numbers in its state population. So the South really got to manipulate slavery in a way that protected a lot of its interests in the new government. So ultimately, after so many compromises to building the government, now it came time to actually build the government. And as we said before, there were going to be three branches of the United States government. There would be the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And we've already talked a little bit about the legislature. And the legislature is going to make laws for the country. And the way it works is that the Senate and House of Representatives have to vote on a bill that has the same language in those laws. Okay, even if there's a one-word difference, the laws aren't the same, and Congress hasn't officially passed that law. Now, the Senate and House have differences between them as well. So in the Senate, senators serve in their positions for 6 years, and every other year, 1/3 of the Senate is going to be up for election. So the entire Senate does not get reelected at the same time. Senators also have to be at least 30 years old, and they can be reelected an unlimited number of times. If we go over to the House of Representatives, representatives serve for 2-year terms. And in the House of Representatives, the House is up for re-election every 2 years. And every single person in the House gets re-elected every 2 years. So in theory, the House of Representatives could be entirely voted out of office and a whole new House of Representatives comes back to work after an election. Representatives have to be at least 25 years old, so you can be a little bit younger in the House of Representatives, and you can also be reelected to the House an unlimited number of times. So there's no term limits in Congress, which is why we hear of congressmen, either senators or representatives, having terms that have had them in office for 20 or 30 or more years. In the Senate, there are 2 votes per state. So we can figure out how many senators are in Congress today. If there's 50 states, 2 votes per state, how many senators do we have? And over here in the House of Representatives, the votes in the House are determined by population size. Originally, as the population of the United States kept growing and growing and growing, the number of representatives in Congress continued to grow as well. However, today, it doesn't matter if the population increases or not. There are always going to be 435 votes in the House of Representatives. The Senate is considered the upper house and has certain powers. Among those powers, it approves nominations to the Supreme Court or cabinet positions. And the lower house has other responsibilities, for example, over the nation's money. And budgetary bills or laws begin in the House of Representatives. So if we wanted to see how many representatives each state has, we can take a look at this map right here, and there are 3 different colors on this map. And the reason why a census is so important is because it can reapportion congressional districts, meaning you might get more or less representatives based on the number of people you have in your state. So for example, if we take a look at the darker colored states here, okay, we see that these darker colored states gained a seat in the House of Representatives as a result of the 2010 census. The states here, the majority of the states, did not see a drastic change in their populations. So they did not change the number of seats they had in Congress. These states up here all lost a seat or 2 seats or however many seats they may have lost in Congress because their populations may have gone down with respect to other states' populations. Now we can see that there are certain states that have a huge number of representatives. For example, we take a look at California. California has the biggest population in the United States. It has 53 representatives in the House of Representatives. However, the biggest state in the United States is Alaska by territory. However, there's not too many people up in Alaska. They only get one vote in the House of Representatives. If we look at New Jersey has 12 votes in the House of Representatives. Plus our 2 senators means we get 14 people in Congress. We actually lost a representative as a result of the 2010 census. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of the 2020 census that is still ongoing now. So again, how many people are in Congress? The Senate, 2 votes per state, is 100 votes. In the House of Representatives, it's 435 votes. And then the House of Representatives also allows representation for other areas that the United States has control over, but aren't states in the United States just yet. So for example, Washington, D.C. is a federal district. It's not a state. They get a representative to represent their interests in Congress, but that person is not allowed to cast a vote. Other territories have the same privilege, like American Samoa or Puerto Rico or Guam or the Virgin Islands. They get a voice in Congress, but they don't get to vote on any of the laws. So there are 535 individuals who have voting authority in the Senate and House of Representatives. There's 541 total seats when we include these 6 territories here. The executive branch carries out the nation's laws, meaning they're the individuals who have to go out and make sure that Americans are following the laws of the land. This branch of government is headed by the President of the United States, with the Vice President being the second in command. The leaders of this branch are elected every 4 years. In the beginning of the United States, there was no term limit. Most presidents ended up retiring the presidency after 2 terms. George Washington was asked to continue and serve in a 3rd term, and he decided that he didn't want to do that. So, following his example, many presidents served for 2 terms and then retired from the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s ran and won 4 terms in office. The 22nd Amendment would be passed or ratified later on, and that would change it and revert the presidency back to a 2-term limit. The executive branch also has cabinet members, and the cabinet is not his talking dishes and teacups. The cabinet is all the advisors that advise the president in different important areas in our country. So for example, we hear about the Secretary of State that might advise the president on different foreign relations that the United States has. The Secretary of Defense has an interest in protecting the country. The Secretary of Education, we have the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Transportation, many other secretaries who advise the president in different key areas and might encourage him to carry out or propose laws in different areas. The president can approve or reject laws that are passed by Congress and nominates federal positions. So the president, when Congress passes a law, it doesn't just automatically become law. The president has to say, yes, this is a good law and signs off on it, or no, this is a bad law, and he can or she can vote to reject that law by using what's called a veto. The president also nominates federal positions, like his cabinet members or judges that go on to serve on the federal courts. However, we saw before that the Senate approves presidential nominations to the Supreme Court, and actually that should be revised to say all courts at the federal level. So now we get to the court system, and that's the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the laws in the United States. The judicial branch established a court system that could overrule state court decisions. We saw that state courts were not in agreement with one another or with federal law under the Articles of Confederation. And that created a huge problem for the federal government, that the states could actually overrule the national government. And that was a huge, huge problem that the founders saw. So they created a judicial branch with federal courts that could overrule state court decisions. Now, the judicial branch has to interpret the law and decide, does a law truly agree with the United States Constitution? If the law agrees with the Constitution, then it's a good law. However, they can say that a law is unconstitutional, that it violates the Constitution and therefore needs to be removed as a law. So they can actually strike down laws that have been passed, even if it's been approved by Congress, even if it's been approved by the president. If a law is unconstitutional, it does not get to exist any longer. The Supreme Court today is the top federal court, and once the Supreme Court renders a decision, that decision cannot be overturned by any other court in the country. There are 9 judges on the Supreme Court, 1 Chief Justice, and his name is John Roberts, and there are 8 associate justices. Now, there's always an odd number of judges on the court. In the Supreme Court that was originally created, there were 7 judges, and they increased that number to 9. And that's so there is always an odd number of judges on the Supreme Court. If there's an odd number of judges, it's impossible to tie since everyone is rendering a decision. So if I have 9 judges, even if I have a 5-4 decision, 5 judges might say yes, 4 judges might say no. The 5 judges who said yes would win, and that whatever they ruled would become law and become practiced in the United States. However, let's just say, for example, we had 8 judges on the Supreme Court, and 4 judges said yes, and 4 judges said no. Well, the Supreme Court then doesn't officially have a position and doesn't vote to change a law, uphold a law, or get rid of a law. So there's a tie. The odd number exists so that the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, is always giving a decision. So that was a very quick overview of what the Constitution was written to look like. What we're going to be doing today is going through these questions here, and these questions went along in order with the video. So if you need to replay this video at any time, go back and replay the video. Make sure you're doing your questions and answers in complete sentences. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out and ask.